After Germany's defeat in the Second World War, the country remained fragmented, divided into 4 zones: Soviet, British, American, and French. Unlike the other nations, the Soviet Union decided to establish a separate socialist government within its zone of Germany. To create a new state. In 1949, the infamous German Democratic Republic was born. Our story begins with the rise of the era's most powerful and populous intelligence agency, the Stasi. In the German Democratic Republic, once the communists came to power, the question arose of creating a dedicated intelligence service to carry out the specific tasks of the state. In the year 1947, the so-called K5 was established, the Fifth Commissariat, which functioned as a kind of political police. In the year 1950, based on this structure, the Ministry for State Security was founded. In German, it is called Staatssicherheit, commonly abbreviated as Stasi. That is how it came into existence. The Stasi was created for control. Total control. Like the NKVD and KGB in the USSR, Stasi agents infiltrated all aspects of life, particularly for those considered threats to the socialist regime. The agency was officially the shield and sword of East Germany's Socialist Unity Party. The Stasi was a repressive tool under Kremlin control. Its methods differed from the Soviet services and sometimes even surpassed them. The Stasi was created by the Soviet intelligence services. In principle, Lavrentiy Beria is considered the godfather of the Stasi. That fact alone speaks volumes, clearly indicating that the Stasi was essentially a replica of the NKVD. Why did it become more successful? It seems that it was regarded as the primary and final stronghold of Soviet influence.
The Stasi was far worse than the Gestapo, at least in terms of its treatment of its own citizens. The Gestapo had 40,000 personnel to control 80 million people, while the Stasi employed 102,000 agents to oversee just 17 million.
During the Cold War, the Stasi was seen as the world's most powerful intelligence agency. Its agents knew virtually everything about every resident of the German Democratic Republic. Their motto was, "No information is insignificant." The Ministry for State Security's basements held files on nearly every citizen. If lined up, the archive shelves would stretch 110 kilometers. This excludes data from 23,000 tapes, over 2 million photos, and 10,000 bags of Gerichtskonserven. What Gerichtskonserven are, we will explain a bit later. In essence, within the country, the Stasi functioned as a complete analog of the Gestapo, but with the methods of the KGB. In foreign intelligence, it acted as a branch of the KGB's main intelligence directorate. Once again, it was nearly impossible to determine where the Stasi ended and the KGB began. Particular attention was paid to personal correspondence. Mailboxes near homes were constantly monitored and photographed. Dropped letters were carefully opened, read and returned. If anything seemed suspicious, the letter was confiscated and the recipient was detained. Keeping anything secret was physically impossible. Another example, parcels. Nearly 25 million packages were sent yearly from West Germany to East Germany, and the Stasi opened every one.
Indeed, it can be stated that the Stasi controlled absolutely every aspect of life in the German Democratic Republic. Personal space simply did not exist. Erich Mielke once said, "We must control everything. That is the primary task, the core duty of the Chekists."
Meet Erich Mielke, the director of the Stasi. It was under his leadership that the organization earned its notorious reputation. During his tenure, the intelligence service grew into one of the world's most successful and powerful. He was the sole head of the agency from 1957 to 1989. His paranoia about betrayal pushed him to absurd extremes. Mielke's reputation preceded him. He was widely known, respected and feared. A man who graduated from the Interbrigade school. A man who fought in Spain. A man who fought against Nazi Germany on the side of the Red Army. He trained in the schools of the NKVD and the MGB. In the year 1953, following a public speech and the failures of his predecessor, he was appointed head of the Stasi. And essentially, he remained in that position without interruption until the late 1980s. In other words, the entire structure of the state security apparatus of the German Democratic Republic was built by this man. Mielke demanded absolute loyalty from his staff, especially candidates. New recruits swore to fight against socialism's enemies. Violating this oath meant being placed on a blacklist. No one was sent to prison, they were executed immediately. Once someone joined the agency, there were only two ways out: retirement, having served with so-called honor, or death.
One could say that Erich Mielke was to the Stasi what Wilhelm Canaris was to the Abwehr. He led the organization during its most formative period and shaped its core principles.
In fact, he was the Himmler of his time, if we compare him to other German intelligence figures, because he turned the Stasi into a state within a state. Its influence was so vast that it operated independently, without being subordinate to any other government institution.
People were being watched everywhere. No one ever knew who was leaking information. It could be a neighbor, or even a best friend. The names of informants only became known after the reunification of Germany and the opening of the Stasi archives. Today, it is very easy to find out who was spying on you. But Germans rarely use this chance, as informants were often close relatives.
In one of my interviews, a former Stasi officer recalled, "Most of the people we approached ended up becoming our informants. Only in rare cases did they refuse. We felt it was our duty to know every person's vulnerabilities. For example, if we needed a pastor, we'd investigate any alcohol issues to use as leverage later."
When the Stasi archives were declassified in the year 1990, and every citizen of Germany was given the opportunity to submit a request and view their personal file, many were deeply shocked. They discovered that they had been reported on by women, neighbors, supervisors, and subordinates. Brothers had informed on brothers. In other words, there were countless methods used to compel people to report on one another.
All of these methods were inherited from their Soviet colleagues. The Stasi and Soviet services closely collaborated, sharing beneficial information. It reached the point where Soviet agent branches operated in East Germany with rights equal to those in the USSR. The Kremlin created a monster that not only mirrored its creator, but in some ways even surpassed it.
This cooperation often went far beyond conventional boundaries. In fact, I would say it consistently exceeded the limits of what could be considered normal collaboration. Throughout its entire existence, the Stasi remained, whether to a greater or lesser extent, under the control of the KGB.
Chekists shared dissident persecution tactics with East Germans. Stasi agents were more skillful than Soviet counterparts in these operations. Zersetzung was one method. Its aim was to humiliate and psychologically destabilize someone through manipulation. When no one was home, agents entered and rearranged items. They called repeatedly at night, tampered with alarms, or left mysterious packages. The victim would feel like they were losing their mind. Often this psychological torment led to suicide.
Agents would break into apartments, move flower pots on the windowsill, or change the placement of personal belongings. They even resorted to grotesque tactics, such as sending a coffin for a child to a young family. The goal was to disrupt the normal rhythm of life, to instill uncertainty and self-doubt. Career sabotage was another common tactic. For example, puncturing a bicycle tire so that the person would be late for work. After several such incidents, workplace issues would inevitably arise.
The Zersetzung method was primarily used against individuals who had already been flagged as politically unreliable, because it required significant effort. The target had to be tracked to ensure they were not at home. One group would monitor them. If necessary, they would detain the person, provoke a fight, involve them as a witness in a staged traffic accident, or create a scandal in a store by planting a can of food in their basket and accusing them of theft. Multiple agents and security teams were involved in such operations. And despite the vast resources of the German Democratic Republic and its powerful security apparatus, there were never enough personnel to target everyone. But that was never the goal.
The Stasi controlled Berlin-Hohenschönhausen prison, holding escapees, dissidents, and suspects. There they were brutally tortured and learned various information about their activities and possible involvement in groups that want to overthrow the regime in the GDR. Berlin-Hohenschönhausen had once belonged to the Soviet Union and was known as Special Camp No. 3. It was a place for physical elimination. In the 1950s, it became the Stasi's secret pre-trial detention center, erased from all maps. Prisoner treatment there was deeply disturbing.
The methods were still the same, and plus the methods were Gestapo. If we recall the film, 17 Moments of Spring, or more precisely, the book, it contains a striking line, that only someone completely unfamiliar with the Gestapo's operational system could believe they could vanish without a trace in the murky tide of refugees and chaos. In that system, every second person was reporting on their neighbor.
A prison guard would routinely ask if he could help in any way. One day, I asked, "Could you return my pack of cigarettes? It was in my backpack, and I really want to smoke." He replied, "Yes, of course." When I returned, the cigarettes were on the table, without matches or a lighter. They had done it deliberately. I never got to smoke.
The man who endured that imprisonment is a historian. People like him were watched with both eyes wide open. Special attention was given to surveillance of politicians in other countries. One such story took place at the West German Embassy in Washington. There, the Stasi planted Ellen Romech, a figure surrounded by myths. In the 1960s, she was labeled a spy and accused of ties to the Stasi. One version says Romech worked at a club for high-ranking officials. There, she reportedly gathered information and passed it to East Germany. She was rumored to have had a romance with President Kennedy. The FBI quickly launched an inquiry. Though her Stasi ties were never proven, she was still expelled from the US.
The Stasi reached all the way to America. What secrets Kennedy may have revealed to her, amid a growing crisis, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and under the intense scrutiny that Khrushchev tried to impose around the United States, we can only speculate. The use of dancers and seductresses to gather intelligence is nothing new. We can recall Marta Hari, Olga Chekova, and the women of questionable reputation who were recruited to seduce Austro-Hungarian officers in Budapest cabarets. In essence, there was nothing revolutionary in the tactic. What it does reveal is the caliber of a person who managed to penetrate the highest levels of American security and counterintelligence.
As for Karl-Heinz Kurres, the facts are now well established. He was a West Berlin police officer and Stasi informant. Kurres leaked info on officers, personnel changes, police operations, and plans against East Germany. And there were many like Kurres. Sources estimate unofficial Stasi collaborators numbered between 100,000 and 200,000.
It is difficult to determine the exact number, because even when individuals were counted or engaged on a more formal level, it usually occurred within the framework of a single operation. Afterward, they were recruited and kept under control through fear, the constant fear that any moment pressure or threats could be directed toward their family members. The Stasi maintained an extensive and far-reaching global network of operatives who, at any given moment, were prepared to carry out acts of terrorism, sabotage, or any other actions that could inflict harm upon society. This is precisely how they controlled their unofficial collaborators.
Kurres's case was somewhat different. He was never coerced into cooperation. He came forward voluntarily and offered his services. He performed well and survived after his Stasi dismissal. However, he was cut off following an incident that occurred in June of the year 1967. Protesters, many students, filled the streets when Kurres, acting as a police officer, shot 26-year-old Benno Ohnesorg in the head. The demonstrator died, and the Stasi quickly ended cooperation with their agent. All Kurres's attempts to rejoin the Stasi were rejected. He retired quietly and lived peacefully until 2014, never facing accountability for his crime. Within the ranks of the Stasi, there were tens of thousands of personnel. Each had a clearly defined role. They operated in nearly every aspect of life in East Germany, not counting those outside East Berlin. In Communist Germany, law enforcement and the party elite controlled individual information, making it easy to join the Stasi.
The entire Stasi operated with approximately 90,000 registered agents, which at the time amounted to roughly one agent for every 180 residents of the German Democratic Republic. The population stood at around 16 million, meaning that every 180th person was, in effect, a potential Stasi operative. These figures may sound exaggerated, but they are far from inaccurate. In fact, those 90,000 were only the officially registered agents. Many documents were either destroyed or secretly transported to Moscow by Soviet intelligence services, making it nearly impossible to determine the exact number today.
You remember when we spoke about Erich's Konserven? Translated literally, it means preserved smells. A truly fascinating method. Stasi agents had access to ampoules containing the scent of suspected individuals. When opened, trained dogs could easily track the person. Surprisingly, Erich's Konserven wasn't the only method used to find targets.
These preserved scents were often collected from fabric taken from a chair that the suspect had previously sat on, or from pieces of clothing, usually items that had been stolen directly from their apartment. They were primarily used to help narrow down the circle of suspects during investigations, but these scents were never regarded as formal evidence in a court of law. This did not confirm that this person was really guilty.
The Stasi could also track individuals in a crowd using radioactive elements. For example, they might sprinkle a tiny amount of radioactive material onto someone's clothing and then follow them using a Geiger counter. That is, the control over the population was, in principle, total. Citizens often remained unaware of this surveillance until their neighbor, mother, or grandmother suddenly disappeared. Fear was the Stasi's primary weapon.
By exploiting fear, the Stasi deployed agents into places where even ordinary law enforcement dared not look. Meet Gunther Guillaume. He is considered the most successful spy in the history of the Stasi. His story began in the 1950s when East Germany sent him and his wife to West Berlin as refugees. After years adapting, he infiltrated politics and by the 1970s became a trusted aide to Chancellor Willy Brandt. From that moment on, Guillaume actively funneled information to Moscow about the political intentions of the federal government. Researchers believe his espionage helped ratify the treaty defining West Germany's eastern borders after the war.
One way or another, after he became a personal aide, every secret of the Federal Republic of Germany concerning intelligence and counterintelligence operations within the territory of the German Democratic Republic became fully accessible to the Stasi, and this continued until 1975. He was placed under surveillance for 11 months, but authorities were unable to catch him in the act. It was only in the year 1975 that he was arrested and sentenced to 13 years in prison, while his wife received a sentence of 8 years.
Willy Brandt resigned, and the operation became the Stasi's most successful. Collaboration with politicians was common for the agency. Former German Chancellor Helmut Kohl also made use of its services.
In fact, the Stasi maintained close and deliberate ties with certain political figures. It is enough to say that Chancellor Helmut Kohl received information directly from Stasi agents. Consequently, all analytical reports and decisions were made under the influence of intelligence provided by East Germans and the Soviet Union.
In the 1980s, the Stasi infiltrated US-Soviet missile treaty negotiations. The reason was clear: West Germany housed NATO's primary strike component. The Americans had deployed more than 100 launch systems for intermediate-range ballistic missiles. The Soviet Union faced great risk. A missile could hit vital targets in under 10 minutes, and interception was nearly impossible. The Stasi helped facilitate the 1987 US-Soviet treaty to eliminate intermediate and short-range missiles.
The fact is, the Stasi, as an organization, succeeded in infiltrating an enormous number of agents into NATO command structures, into the leadership of NATO forces in Europe, and even into American institutions. This was possible because the United States, operating on German territory, often recruited local specialists, engineers, electronics experts, and general support staff. By strategically placing agents, the Stasi gained near-complete access to information on missile deployments, military bases, personnel, security, and duty rotations. All of this was uncovered and meticulously reported.
In 1989, the country was shaken by a coup. An enraged crowd stormed the Stasi headquarters. To prevent leaks about German agents, the Soviet Union began destroying documents. Files were torn, shredded, and stuffed into sacks. Much of the archive was damaged, and restoration efforts continue today. At the same time, the Stasi itself was officially dissolved. And thus ended the story of the powerful yet infamous German agency.